When the name of Genghis Khan is mentioned, most people immediately imagine a ruthless conqueror on horseback, tearing through battlefields, sending thousands of soldiers to their deaths without hesitation. A man who was both merciless and strategic. Forged in the harsh winds of the Mongolian steppes, he rose from the leader of a small tribe to the founder of the largest contiguous empire the world has ever seen. His name became synonymous with fear and power. But hidden in the shadows of this glorious imperial narrative lies another story, one cloaked in silence, one barely acknowledged even between the lines of history books, the tragedy of women. Especially the dark fate of those who were forced into the harems of Genghis Khan. When the Mongol invasions began, it was not only cities that were shattered, but also the lives of their inhabitants. As the armies reached the gates, the outcome for the besieged population was almost always the same. Men were slaughtered or enslaved, wealth was plundered, and women were regarded as the most prized spoils of war. This notion was not unique to the Mongols. Throughout history, empires often considered women as natural rewards of conquest. Yet under Genghis Khan, this practice became more systematic, more brutal. Women were not only valued for their bodies, but also for their political significance. The presence of a princess or noblewoman in the harem symbolized the submission of her people. The fall of a city sealed the fate of its women instantly. Homes were destroyed, families were torn apart, mothers separated from children, wives ripped from husbands. Many women were dragged by their arms or bound in chains before soldiers. There, they were subjected to a ruthless selection based on age, beauty, and lineage. The youngest and most beautiful were set aside for the Khan himself or his highest-ranking generals. The rest were given to lower-ranking soldiers or sold into slave markets. For the women, this was not merely a transfer of ownership, it was the erasure of identity. From that moment on, they existed not by their names, but by the value of their bodies. From the outside, the harem may have appeared as a place of luxury, tents draped with silks, rich banquets, glittering jewels. But beneath this opulence lay muffled cries and concealed tears. The harem was, in truth, a silent graveyard, not only of bodies, but of souls. Women stripped of their freedom, deprived of the right to shape their own destinies. A princess who once embodied hope for her people could become nothing more than a concubine in the eyes of the Khan, transformed from a living symbol of sovereignty into a silent shadow of another empire. For most women, the heaviest burden was the loss of self. One day she sang in her native tongue, prayed in her faith, and ate at her family's table. The next she was forced into an alien language, an unfamiliar culture, and a foreign religion. Many were coerced into adopting Mongol customs, expected to abandon their pasts. Yet the human mind does not forget so easily. Memories clung to them, sometimes as a source of strength, but often as chains of grief and longing. Life inside the harem was unpredictable. A few women might capture the Khan's attention, bear children, and gain influence if their sons rose to positions of power. But these were rare exceptions. The vast majority lived and died as nameless shadows, consumed in silence, their existence unrecorded in the chronicles of history. Their voices went unheard, their stories unwritten. Silence itself became their greatest shackle. Behind that silence lay unbearable psychological torment. Women were enslaved not only in body but in spirit. Perhaps the cruelest pain of all was motherhood under such circumstances. To bear a child that no longer belonged to her people but to her captors. This twisted even the most sacred bond into anguish. A mother's love for her child was mingled with the bitter knowledge that he or she was severed from her own identity, claimed by an empire built on blood. Thus Genghis Khan's harem was not merely a place of pleasure but a political instrument, a stage for the empire as dominance and power. The women's suffering became one of the hidden, heaviest costs of conquest. Their tears remained silent witnesses to lands soaked in blood, their voices forever buried beneath the weight of history. When a woman was taken into the harem of Genghis Khan or one of his commanders, her life was irreversibly transformed. This change was not only spatial but also deeply psychological and social. One day, she might live an ordinary life with her family in her home. The next, she would find herself in the tent of a conqueror or in the cold chambers of a stone fortress surrounded by hundreds of unfamiliar women. The transition was so sudden and so absolute that many women scarcely had time to comprehend what had happened before realizing their freedom had been completely stripped away. From the outside, the harem might have seemed like an orderly institution, but inside, it was ruled by a complex hierarchy. Women were categorized based on their origins and social status. Princesses and queens from noble families often held a position above the others. Their role was not only to serve as companions to the Khan or his generals, but also to act as political symbols. Their presence in the harem was a deliberate reminder that their people had been subjugated. The rest of the women, drawn from common families, were regarded merely as concubines or assigned to service roles, treated as secondary wives with little to no status. This hierarchy inevitably bred tension among the women themselves. A woman who rose to become the Khan's favorite was granted authority over the others. She could enjoy better food, finer clothes, and more comfortable quarters. Yet such privilege always came with danger. Her rise provoked jealousy, resentment, and even sabotage from rivals. The harem thus became not only a place of male dominance over women, but also a silent and often deadly arena of competition among the women themselves. Daily life in the harem was defined largely by emptiness and waiting. Women spent most of their time adorning themselves, preparing and waiting for the possibility of being chosen. This endless anticipation became a form of psychological torment. Each night, speculation arose over which woman would be summoned to the Khan. For those not chosen, it was a humiliation. For those who were, it was often an ordeal filled with fear and coercion. Consent was irrelevant. Silence and obedience were the only expectations. One of the most striking aspects of the harem was the absolute strangeness of the women to one another. They were drawn from every corner of the empire, from Georgia and China, from Persia and Rus. A Georgian princess might share the same space with the daughter of a Chinese merchant, a Persian villager alongside the daughter of a Russian prince. They shared no language, no culture, no faith. Their only common thread was suffering. Unable to speak with one another, they often communicated through glances, gestures, or silence. In this sense, the harem was a mosaic of conquered worlds, but a mosaic held together by blood and tears. Control and surveillance were another constant of their daily existence. The harem was a heavily guarded space. Women were forbidden from contact with the outside world, stripped of the ability to act independently. They lived under constant watch, sometimes guarded day and night against even the slightest possibility of escape. This perpetual surveillance destroyed not only their freedom, but also their spirit. To live without any power over one's own life is itself a profound form of torment. And yet within this darkness, some women found ways to endure. A few used their beauty and charm to gain favor. Others relied on intelligence, weaving plots and intrigues to carve out a position. Some chose silence and invisibility, attempting to survive by avoiding attention. But neither prominence nor obscurity guaranteed safety. Both could bring peril. The harem existed on a razor's edge of fragile balance. Bearing children elevated a woman's status, but this too came with tragedy. The child no longer belonged to her people, but to the Mongol Empire. As the boy grew, he might become a soldier, a commander, or even a ruler who would march against his own mother's homeland. For the mother, this created an unbearable inner conflict. She loved her child, yet she suffered knowing he would be turned into a weapon against the people from whom she herself was torn. In this sense, the harems of Genghis Khan were not only prisons for women, but also monuments to the humiliation of entire conquered nations. The women's tears, their silent screams, and their suppressed identities formed one of the darkest legacies of the empire. They became the forgotten victims of history, hidden in the shadows of conquest, yet carrying its deepest tragedy. From the outside, the harem might have appeared as a place of splendor where women lived quietly, but inside it was a battleground of invisible wars. These battles were fought not with swords or armies, but with wit, ambition, and the instinct to survive. Within the walls of the harem, it was not only men who exerted dominance over women. There was also a silent yet ruthless competition among the women themselves. A woman in the harem had to choose carefully how to survive. The most dangerous path was to stand out and seek the favor of the Khan. Being a favorite concubine came with great allure, better meals, finer clothing, a more secure life, and sometimes even influence within the palace. Yet such a rise carried immense risk. One woman's ascent meant another's decline. A favored concubine often became the target of jealousy, hatred, and sabotage. Accounts tell of poisons secretly added to drinks or meals, false accusations, and covert attempts to bring rivals down. Behind these intrigues lay a bare struggle for survival. A woman who attracted too little attention risked being forgotten, while one who attracted too much risked destruction. Among the women, there were not only rivalries, but also necessary alliances. Women from the same region, or who spoke the same language, often clung to one another. Persian women whispered their troubles to one another, while Chinese women shared songs from their pasts. These small alliances sometimes became a sanctuary, a way to endure. Yet even these connections were dangerous. Guards and overseers were wary of women growing too close, often separating them. Any display of solidarity could be seen as the seed of rebellion. Most women were therefore forced to live in isolation. Psychological collapse was one of the greatest threats in the harem. Women spent days, weeks, sometimes months waiting without any task to occupy themselves. This endless anticipation gnawed at the soul. Each night it was uncertain who the Khan or his commanders would summon. Those not called felt worthless. Those who were summoned trembled with fear. The selection was never a reward, it was an obligation. Their bodies were never under their own control. Night after night, the same uncertainty, the same fear, and the same silence persisted. Some women developed ways to endure this psychological torment. Some clung tightly to their memories, recalling their homeland, childhood, and mothers. These memories helped them remain upright, even if only slightly. Others found strength in prayer and faith. Women of different beliefs sometimes silently joined each other in rituals, kneeling together in quiet prayer. This was a small yet meaningful way to remind themselves that they were still human. For others, the burden became unbearable. It is said that some women fell ill, quietly broke down, or even took their own lives. In a place where freedom was completely stripped away and identity erased, the will to live could slowly wither. In this sense, the harem was not just a prison of bodies, but a grave of souls. Yet traces of quiet resistance could still be found. Some women, after winning the Khan's favor, managed to preserve aspects of their homeland's culture in small ways. A recipe, an embroidery pattern, a lullaby. These were tiny but powerful acts of defiance, ways of refusing to let their pasts be completely erased. Women also secretly told each other stories. These tales became small lights of hope within their inner worlds. Each story was a symbol of an identity that had not been lost, a culture that could not be destroyed. The harem was a place of contradictions, silence and obedience on one side, secret resistance on the other. Jealousy and intrigue on one side, forced solidarity on the other. The struggle to survive took countless forms within this confined space. Every woman chose her own path, yet they all shared one undeniable truth: their freedom had been taken from them. In the silent world of the harem, one of the deepest bonds for women was motherhood. Yet in a place where freedom and personal identity were systematically stripped away, this bond became profoundly complex and painful. When women gave birth, their joy was fleeting and incomplete because their children were no longer solely theirs. They had also become instruments for the future of the Mongol Empire. Every boy born would be raised to become a soldier, a commander, or a member of the ruling lineage. Every girl would eventually serve in another harem or be used for political alliances. For the mother, this created an indescribable dilemma. On one hand, she felt the natural love and instinct of motherhood. On the other, she carried the burden of knowing her child would be used against her own people. This emotional conflict often left lasting scars on a woman's psyche. Some mothers quietly attempted to teach their children about their own culture, singing lullabies in their native tongue. But such acts of subtle resistance had to be performed in secrecy. Even the smallest hint of defiance could endanger both mother and child. Motherhood in the harem was also closely tied to social status. A child, particularly a son, could enhance a mother's position within the harem. Women favored by the Khan could gain privileges and better protection thanks to their children. Yet these advantages did not equate to true freedom. They only slightly improved the chances of survival. For most women, motherhood was not a guarantee, but rather an added responsibility and source of anxiety. The process of raising these children was itself tragic. Children born in the harem were separated from their native cultures and reared according to Mongol customs. For a mother, seeing her child nurtured in a foreign culture and for the service of a foreign empire brought a mixture of pride and pain. Every child grew under her love, yet was simultaneously being shaped to become a tool or weapon for another power. Sometimes mothers gave their children names in their native language and shared stories from their own heritage. These small acts of resistance became sources of hope for both the mother and the child. Through them, the child would carry a piece of his or her mother's past, refusing to become entirely part of a foreign culture. Yet more often than not, this was insufficient. As the child grew, the pressures of Mongol culture intensified, and the mother's influence waned. The weight of this struggle pressed ever more heavily on the women's inner lives. Motherhood in the harem tested women's psychological and emotional resilience to the extreme. They were responsible not only for their own survival, but also for the futures of their children. One mistake could imperil both mother and child. As a result, women lived in constant vigilance, their attention and alertness never wavering. Years spent in the harem eroded their spirit. The combination of silence, obedience, and fear relentlessly tested their psychological endurance. For a woman with a child, the harem became a place where hope and tragedy coexisted. Daily life, dependent on the favor of the Khan or his commanders, could shift suddenly. One day she might rise among the favored. The next, a careless misstep could lead to a sudden fall. This uncertainty kept women in a perpetual state of tension and anxiety. Motherhood in the harem was never purely personal, it was also a strategic tool of the empire. The children women bore would one day serve as soldiers, leaders, or political instruments through arranged marriages, shaping the future of the Mongol Empire. In this way, their role as mothers transcended personal love, becoming an essential part of history itself. The harems of Genghis Khan did not merely leave a temporary mark on the women of the era. Their lives became a lasting cultural and psychological legacy. This legacy was felt deeply on both individual and societal levels. Women, having lost their freedom and been forced to erase their identities, began measuring their worth solely through the eyes of the Khan or the imperial authority. This left enduring effects on their psyche, which in many cases extended indirectly to subsequent generations. Even after leaving the harem, a woman's life remained largely controlled. If her child was being raised for a Mongol commander or a member of the royal lineage, she was no longer just a mother, but also seen as an instrument shaping the future. This responsibility weighed heavily on many women. They had to fight, not only to survive themselves, but also to ensure the safety and proper upbringing of their children. The constant stress and anxiety they experienced became a psychological inheritance of their years in the harem. The harem also profoundly shaped women's social roles. Their value was assessed primarily through their obedience and physical presence, while personality, intellect, and skills were often ignored. This system eroded their self-confidence and damaged their sense of identity. Even women who survived the harem often carried this burden into the outside world. Their worldview and life strategies were molded by years of navigating constant surveillance, control, and the need to protect both personal and collective honor. From a cultural perspective, the harem's impact extended beyond individuals to society at large. Children born in the harem were raised as symbols of the empire and strategically married to forge political alliances across tribes and nations. While these children often carried remnants of their mother's cultural heritage, they were simultaneously instruments of Mongol dominance. Women were thus forced to preserve elements of their own identities across generations while adapting to the culture imposed by the empire. Psychologically, the harem left deep, lasting trauma. Living under perpetual fear, uncertainty, competition, and constant surveillance inflicted profound wounds on their inner lives. These wounds were often hidden in silence, unspoken, yet always present. Years in the harem could fundamentally reshape a woman's character, worldview, and survival strategies. Some women survived by burying themselves in silence, while others preserved their spirit through subtle acts of resistance and clever maneuvers. Over the long term, these experiences left marks not only on the women themselves, but also on their children. Children raised in the harem absorbed indirectly the pain and struggles of their mothers and were forced to develop similar survival strategies to maintain their positions. In this way, the harem became more than a place. It functioned as an educational arena, a psychological laboratory, and a mechanism for sustaining the empire. The suffering endured by women cast a shadow over the lives of future generations. Although rarely discussed in historical accounts, the harems of Genghis Khan represent the magnitude of women's tragic experiences. These women, overshadowed by the grandeur and power of the empire, remain silent heroes hidden between the lines of history. Their story reflects not just a specific period, but one of the darkest and most overlooked facets of human history. The suffering within the harem, the loss of freedom, the erasure of identity, and the tragedy of motherhood remains a crucial reality, rarely emphasized in textbooks, yet vital to acknowledge and understand. Genghis Khan's harems left profound marks not only on the women of the era, but also on the cultural fabric of the empire and on subsequent generations. Life within the harem became a quiet yet powerful vehicle of cultural transmission. Women strove to preserve their languages, traditions, cuisines, crafts, and stories. These efforts not only strengthened their psychological resilience, but also prevented their cultural identities from being entirely erased. This subtle transmission laid the foundation for a form of resistance that endured across generations. Within the harem, women found small ways to protect their cultural heritage. A recipe, an embroidery pattern, a song, or a story became a silent method of preserving memory. Though invisible from the outside, these acts carried deep significance inside the harem. Women, consciously or unconsciously, fought to prevent the erasure of their past. These acts were not only survival strategies, but also a means of safeguarding a cultural legacy. Children raised in the harem became carriers of this cultural memory. The songs, stories, and traditions that women recalled were quietly preserved within the children, passing slowly to new generations. Yet this transmission was limited. Children grew up immersed in Mongol culture and customs, and their mother's past often survived only as a hidden memory. For mothers, this was both a source of solace and a constant worry, as their efforts sought to protect not only their own identities, but also those of future generations. The harem was also a critical part of the Mongol Empire's long-term strategy over women. Control over women served as a key instrument in maintaining the empire's stability and power. Through women, marriages, political alliances, and the children they bore, the empire extended its influence across different regions. In this way, the harem functioned not merely as a domestic space, but also as a political and cultural laboratory. The years spent in the harem left lasting psychological effects on the women. Growing up and living under constant surveillance, competition, uncertainty, and fear, they learned to survive with diminished freedom and partially erased identities. This experience shaped not only their interactions with the outside world, but also the way they connected with future generations. Their trauma became a form of cultural memory, impacting both their children and the wider society. In this sense, the harem emerged as one of history's most complex and contradictory spaces. On one hand, women relied on intelligence and strategy to protect their lives. On the other, they worked quietly to preserve their identities and cultural heritage. The tragedies within the harem, though largely invisible, left deep and enduring marks. They played a crucial role in shaping the empire and facilitating cultural transmission, even if history has often overlooked them. Although history books often depict Genghis Khan's harems merely as opulent palaces or symbols of a powerful ruler, the reality was far more profound. Life within these walls deeply transformed the women, leaving echoes of cultural and psychological impact that persisted across generations. The harem was not just a physical space, it was a central stage for the hidden struggles, acts of resistance, and survival of the women who bore silent witness to history. Genghis Khan's harems were not merely spaces of individual tragedy. They were historical laboratories, cultural crossroads, and social symbols. The suffering endured by women shaped not only their own lives, but also the social and cultural fabric of the empire. Each woman in the harem, while having lost her identity, her freedom, and having surrendered her body and fate to others, left a silent mark on history through small acts of resistance, memory, and cultural transmission. Although historians have often overlooked these women's stories, life in the harem had profound effects on the structure of the empire. Through their children and cultural legacies, women created mechanisms of control and cohesion across the empire's vast territories. Each woman, through her child and quiet resistance, ensured that both Mongol culture and her own origins would endure. Thus, the harem became not only a tool to reinforce male dominance, but also a silent repository of cultural preservation and identity. The women of the harem engaged in a struggle that tested their psychological resilience. To survive, they relied on their intelligence, beauty, and strategic acumen, while simultaneously striving to preserve their past and cultural heritage. This required immense psychological endurance. Women who mastered the art of silent resistance were able to protect both their identities and those of future generations. These subtle yet powerful acts of defiance, though overshadowed by the grandeur of the empire, stand as enduring evidence of women's strength and survival instinct throughout history. The harem was also a social symbol. Women were not only individuals, but figures representing the future of society. Their children were raised as guarantees of political alliances and imperial power, and the presence of these women reinforced the empire's boundaries and influence. Consequently, the harem was not merely a living space, but also a center where the political and cultural fabric of the empire was shaped. Over the long term, life in the harem left lasting imprints on women's lives. The loss of freedom, the attempt to erase identity, psychological trauma, and uncertainty resonated across generations. Yet despite these hardships, women fought quietly but effectively to preserve their culture and identity. This struggle became a symbol of resistance that, while often invisible, was never forgotten throughout history. Genghis Khan's harems may appear in history books as symbols of grandeur, power, and conquest. However, the true story lies in the shadows of these displays of might. The tragedies of the women, their struggle to survive, and their acts of cultural resistance. Their tears, silent cries, and suppressed identities represent some of the harshest and most overlooked aspects of history. While these women may have vanished into the shadows of the past, their suffering and the legacies they left behind remain silent yet powerful witnesses to human history. In conclusion, Genghis Khan's harems were not only emblems of power, but also laboratories of women's tragedy, resistance, and cultural heritage. Though these women lost their freedom, had their identities suppressed, and lived lives devoted to the empire, their quiet defiance and survival strategies created one of the darkest yet most compelling stories in history. Every tear, every silent struggle, and every child born in the harem represents a face of human history that must not be forgotten.